At 92 years old, after nearly 7 decades of marriage, I've learned something most people don't want to hear about love. Lasting love isn't about never wanting to leave. It's about choosing to stay over and over again. People think strong marriages survive because two people never fall out of love. That's not true. Most marriages don't end because people stop loving each other. They end because people stop seeing each other. Somewhere between paying bills, raising children, surviving disappointments, and growing older, two people slowly become strangers, living in the same house. I know because there were years when my husband and I sat at the same dinner table and barely recognized the people we had become. When I married Thomas at 23, I believed love would carry us through everything. I thought finding the right person was the hard part. But I spent the next 68 years discovering that love is not something you find once. It is something you keep choosing, especially on the days when it feels difficult. And the truth I'm about to tell you took me almost an entire lifetime to understand. I met my husband Daniel in the summer of 1954 at a church picnic just outside our little town in Ohio. I was 21 years old, wearing a yellow dress my mother had sewn for me, and he was standing by the lemonade table pretending not to stare at me. Back then, love felt simple, magical, like something written in the stars, long before we were born. Daniel made me laugh in a way no one else ever had. He walked me home that evening, and by the time we reached my front porch, I was already imagining our future together. A small house, children running through the yard, growing old side by side in rocking chairs. I truly believed that when you found the right person, love would stay easy forever. And for a while, it did. The first years of marriage felt warm and exciting. We stayed up late talking about dreams, danced barefoot in the kitchen, and kissed goodbye every morning like people in the movies. But somewhere between paying bills and raising babies and working long, exhausting days, little cracks began to appear. Daniel was messy in ways that drove me crazy. He avoided difficult conversations while I wanted to talk about everything immediately. He spent money too freely when I wanted to save every penny. Small disagreements turned into heavy silences that lasted for days. I remember standing at the kitchen sink one night, my hands deep in soapy water, staring out the window while Daniel watched television in the next room. And I thought something that terrified me. Maybe I married the wrong man. I felt ashamed for even thinking it. Nobody prepares you for how lonely marriage can feel sometimes, even when the person you love is sitting only 10 feet away. I thought real love was supposed to feel natural all the time, effortless, certain. But ours suddenly felt confusing and hard. A few weeks later, I confessed all of this to an older woman named Evelyn after Sunday service. She had been married more than 40 years, and I expected her to comfort me, maybe even agree with me. Instead, she smiled gently and said something that changed the course of my life. Love doesn't disappear overnight. Attention does. At the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant, but looking back now, I realize that sentence saved my marriage before I even knew it needed saving. One of the hardest truths about marriage is realizing that the person you fall in love with will not remain the same person forever. Young people rarely understand that. Marriage books don't talk about it enough. Wedding vows don't mention it. At 24, I thought I was choosing one man for the rest of my life. What I didn't know was that I would actually spend the next 60 years meeting many different versions of him. The Daniel I married was ambitious, energetic, and impatient with the world. At 30, he worked long hours and came home exhausted, carrying stress he didn't know how to speak about. At 50, after layoffs hit the factory, he became quieter than I'd ever seen him. Some nights he would sit alone on the porch for hours without saying a word. I used to think his silence meant he was pulling away from me. Later, I realized he was simply trying not to fall apart in front of me. And then old age softened him. By 70, the sharp edges of his personality had faded. He laughed more easily. He held my hand in grocery stores. He cried during movies he would have mocked in his younger years. The man who once rushed through life became gentle and slow, stopping to watch birds outside the kitchen window or telling the same stories over and over again with that crooked smile I still miss every day. But the truth is, I changed just as much. At 25, I was insecure and eager to please everyone around me. At 40, I became opinionated and stubborn after years of carrying responsibilities quietly. At 53, after losing my sister to cancer, grief changed me completely. I became fearful, softer in some ways, harder in others. And by the time I reached my 80s, I had learned patience in a way my younger self never could have imagined. Sometimes I look back and wonder if the young Daniel and the older version of me would have even understood each other at all. That's the strange thing about lasting love. You don't stay married to one person. You stay married to many versions of the same soul. Again and again, life introduces you to someone new, wearing the face of the person you once knew. And if you're lucky, you learn how to keep falling in love with who they are becoming instead of grieving who they used to be. The closest we ever came to losing our marriage had nothing to do with cheating. It wasn't some dramatic betrayal or explosive fight like people imagine. The real danger arrived quietly, slowly, so slowly that we barely noticed it happening at first. We stopped listening to each other, not the kind of listening where you hear words, but the kind where you still care about what's happening inside the other person. Daniel would talk about work, and I'd nod while washing dishes, barely paying attention. I would tell him stories about my day, and he'd answer without ever looking up from the newspaper. We weren't cruel to each other. We weren't even angry most of the time. We were simply distracted, tired, existing side by side like two people managing a household instead of building a life together. That kind of loneliness is difficult to explain unless you've lived it. There is something deeply painful about sitting across from someone for 20 years and realizing they no longer truly see you. We still paid bills together, raised our children together, ate dinner at the same table every night, but emotionally, we had started living in separate worlds. The silence between us grew heavier than any argument ever could. I remember one particular winter evening when it hit me hardest. Snow was falling outside, and Daniel sat in his chair half asleep while the television flickered across the room. I looked at him and suddenly realized I had no idea what he dreamed about anymore. I didn't know what scared him. I didn't know what he hoped for, and I wondered if he could still say those things about me. It frightened me more than any fight we'd ever had. Then life interrupted us in the harshest way possible. Daniel lost his job at 52 after nearly 3 decades at the factory. I had never seen a man unravel so quietly. He stopped shaving regularly, stopped laughing. Some mornings he wouldn't even get dressed. And for the first time in years, I truly saw him again. Not as the man who forgot to take out the trash or left his socks on the floor, but as a human being who was scared, ashamed, and hurting. And somehow that crisis woke both of us up. We began talking again, really talking. Late at night over coffee at the kitchen table like we had when we were young. It took the fear of losing ourselves completely to remember that marriage cannot survive on routine alone. Love dies when curiosity dies. And sometimes it takes pain to make two people truly look at each other again. When you are young, you think love is supposed to feel intense all the time. You believe it lives in grand gestures, passionate kisses, dramatic reunions, and the constant excitement of being wanted. Movies teach you that. Songs teach you that. Even weddings teach you that. Nobody tells you what love looks like. After 40 years of paying mortgages, surviving illnesses, burying parents, and waking up beside the same person 10,000 mornings in a row, real love looks much quieter than that. By the time Daniel and I reached our 70s, romance had changed shape completely. The butterflies faded long ago. We no longer stayed up all night talking about dreams or danced barefoot in the kitchen. But something deeper took its place, something steadier. Every morning, Daniel made my coffee exactly the way I liked it. 1 spoon of sugar, a little too much cream. He never had to ask after all those years. And every evening before bed, I laid out his medication beside a glass of water because he always forgot which pills to take after dinner. These things sound small when you say them out loud, ordinary even, but I have learned that love survives inside ordinary things. I remember sitting beside him in a hospital room after his heart surgery, listening to the slow beeping of machines through the night. He slept most of the time, his hand resting weakly in mine, and I realized something in that quiet room that no young version of myself could have understood. Love is not the feeling you have when everything is easy. Love is staying when things become frightening and exhausting and uncertain. There were nights when one of us was sick and the other barely slept. Years when stress made us impatient and tired. Moments when we disappointed each other deeply. But devotion meant continuing to show up anyway, again and again. Not because we always felt romantic, but because caring for each other had become part of who we were. Romance fades. Devotion deepens. That is the part nobody explains to young couples. The deepest kind of love is built through repetition, through thousands of unnoticed acts of care performed over a lifetime, folding his sweater before bed, waiting in the doctor's office together, calling to make sure he arrived safely, reheating dinner when he worked late, memorizing the sound of his footsteps in the hallway. In the end, those small things become the love story. Not the fireworks, not the wedding day, just two people quietly choosing each other in 100 invisible ways every single day. One of the greatest mistakes couples make is keeping score. Who sacrificed more? Who apologized last? Who worked harder? Who gave more love, more effort, more patience? The moment a marriage becomes a competition, intimacy begins to disappear. There were years when Daniel carried almost everything for us. After my surgery at 61, I could barely walk across the living room without help. For months, he cooked every meal, cleaned the house, drove me to appointments, and helped me bathe when I was too weak to do it alone. I remember feeling humiliated one night as he knelt beside me tying my shoes because my hands trembled too badly. Tears rolled down my face, and I whispered, "I'm sorry you have to do all of this." He looked up at me so calmly and said, "This is what we promised each other." Not once during that time did he complain about what was unfair. Not once did he ask when it would finally be my turn to carry the weight again. And then life shifted, as it always does. Years later, when Daniel lost his younger brother unexpectedly, something inside him collapsed. He stopped eating properly, stopped answering phone calls. Some mornings he couldn't even get out of bed. That strong, dependable man I had leaned on for decades suddenly had nothing left to give. So I became the strong one. I held conversations together when he fell silent. I handled the bills. I sat beside him through long nights when grief swallowed him whole. That is what mature love understands. Some seasons of marriage are 50 over 50. Most are not. Sometimes one person can only give 10% while the other gives 90%. And then life changes again and the roles reverse. Love that lasts is not measured by fairness in every moment. It survives because two people stop counting altogether. Daniel has been gone for 8 years now, and what surprises me most is not what I remember about him. I don't spend my days thinking about anniversaries or romantic vacations or the big milestones people put into photo albums. The things that stay with me are much smaller than that. Sometimes, early in the morning, I still imagine I hear his footsteps coming down the hallway, slow and uneven near the end, but familiar enough that my heart still reacts before my mind remembers he's gone. I miss the way he said my name from the other room when he couldn't find his glasses, even though they were usually sitting right on his head. I even miss the habits that used to irritate me for years. The humming while he shaved, the cabinet doors he never fully closed, the way he always fell asleep in his chair before the end of every movie. Funny, isn't it? The things that once tested my patience became the very things I ache for now. When you lose someone after building a lifetime together, you realize perfection had nothing to do with love. Daniel was not a perfect husband, and Lord knows I wasn't a perfect wife. We disappointed each other more times than I can count. We misunderstood each other, hurt each other, grew apart and found our way back again. But maybe that is what a successful marriage really is. Not finding the perfect person. It's learning to keep rediscovering an imperfect one. Learning to look at the person beside you through every season of life and quietly say, I still choose you. At 92, that is the only wisdom I feel certain about anymore. Love that lasts is not built from constant happiness. It is built from commitment, forgiveness, patience, and thousands of ordinary moments shared over time. And if I could live my whole life again, I would still choose him.